This video made possible by Killer Visual Strategies. Visit killervisualstrategies.com.
The topic of personalized medicine, I just wanted to start and say it's one of great personal interest to me. And it's incredibly relevant because in 1994, for those of you that can remember back that far, by joining a biotech startup called EncoreMed in Gaithersburg, Maryland, I stepped off my health policy-focused career path and on to one in the life sciences, and I've never stepped off that one again. EncoreMed was the first company in the country to offer genetic testing for inherited predisposition to an array of cancers, including breast, ovarian, colorectal, and several others. And they were doing so on a commercial basis. That was highly controversial at the time. Fast forward 25 years later, and last year having been diagnosed with what thankfully turned out to be a very early stage, small, slow-growing breast cancer, I was extraordinarily lucky to be able to avail myself of an Oncotype diagnostic test that actually comes out with a very specific score telling me what my recurrence risk is, and also whether there would have been any value to add chemotherapy to my treatment. And fortunately, you can tell by my description, the answer was no. But boy, what a great thing. What that did to me in thinking this over is to realize over the past 25 years how incredibly much the tools and technologies and the clinical relevancy of personalized medicine, what we'll also talk about as precision medicine, the speed at which things are happening now have accelerated tremendously. And I think just based on the panel that's coming up after us, focused on AI, machine learning, cloud computing, we're really moving our data abilities forward. But some of the questions I want to have us talk about here today are, one, are we really moving the needle in a big population way when it comes to clinical outcomes of personalized medicine? Have we overhyped and potentially underdelivered? What will it take to achieve the full potential of personalized medicine across the spectrum of care, from prevention and early diagnosis to treatment and prognosis? Will this information be available to all patients? Will all patients want this information? Who will own the data? Who should own it? So let's get this conversation started so we can hear from the experts we have here. I'm incredibly excited and honored to be joined by three individuals whose companies are leading the way in bringing the tools and information of personalized medicine to drug discovery and development, companion diagnostics, patient care, and other applications. So Kristine Ashcraft is CEO of YouScript. Wave your hand. A precision medicine software company that provides real-time drug and dose optimization at the point of care. Amanda Enstrom, PhD, is the Chief Product Officer of Amplion, a software company that has built a novel machine learning-driven intelligence platform to deliver deep insights into pharma and test developer activities. And Brad Gray is CEO of NanoString Technologies, a provider of life science tools for translational research and molecular diagnostics, including the Prosigna breast cancer assay. So you might have heard when I did these introductions, the term precision medicine in the YouScript tagline. All too often, personalized and precision are used interchangeably. Kristine, can you help level set us about what is meant by precision medicine versus personalized medicine?
So I started my journey in personalized medicine back in 2000 when Fortune magazine had an article about a boy named Michael who had died of an overdose because like 1 in 20 people, he had a genetic variation that made his drug unsafe for him. And then it became precision medicine when Obama had a big precision medicine initiative. I think some people dicker over whether it's personalized or precision medicine, but to me, it means you're taking data, you're taking omics, and you're delivering personalized, actionable insights that can improve wellness, wherever that is in the care spectrum.
Does anybody want to add anything to that in terms of thinking of those terms?
I think one of the things we think about at Amplion is how we can actually have biomarkers guide which patients respond best to drugs. And so for us, that is precision medicine, is identifying a small subset of patients that may have a different treatment outcome or even may respond to a specific therapy. And can we identify those targets from the vast array of the biomedical evidence?
The only thing I'd add is I think about it, particularly being here in Seattle where we have so much going on with CAR T therapies, is as we're talking about the term personalized, you're really seeing true personalized treatments when people are sending in samples from their body that are being manipulated, added to, and changed and sent back to them. I think that's kind of pushing the total envelope in the use of the term and the appropriateness of the term personalized. And everything else that we're doing is getting more and more precise, that's for sure. So Brad, when you think about it, a NanoString being, of course, an oncology-focused company, I could have benefited just from the same tests that you offer as much as an Oncotype, and faster, I'm told, by your team, that the roots of personalized medicine seem to be pretty heavily embedded in oncology. And I'm wondering if you can share with us about NanoString and about how you look at that, why it might be that this is where things have taken off in cancer.
Sure. So, I mean, most cancers are a result of the genomics of a set of cells going awry. It's a disease of tissue. And so, understanding what's causing a tumor's growth is something that you can do if you can look at its genomics, look at what DNA mutations it might have and what pathways are up and down regulated. It's also a disease that is where the immune system is a powerful weapon to harness against it, and you can understand the susceptibility of the tumor to the immune system by understanding whether the immune system has seen the tumor, whether the tumor has succeeded in blocking the immune system, et cetera. So, I think precision or personalized medicine has really taken root in cancer because of the biology of that disease, and because we've understood that biology pretty quickly in the scheme of things. We applied the genomics tools to cancer research very early in their own availability. And so when I think about the early examples of precision or personalized medicine, when I first started going to conferences on the topic 15 years ago, we looked at examples like Herceptin, a famous drug therapy for breast cancer that has a specific target that you can detect in a test. We talked then later about a drug called Tarceva that targeted a specific mutation in lung cancer in which some patients had miraculous response if they had that mutation. These were the early success stories, and they are, and I think still cancer every year now has multiple success stories in terms of new therapies making it through the FDA. I think over the years to come, we're going to see a spread in the precision medicine beyond cancer into areas like immunology and transplantation, again, where there's really high stakes in terms of the importance and the expense of the medical decisions, and where we have a pretty good understanding of the biology and what to measure and how to apply that.
Amanda, can you take us through Amplion's approach to accelerating biomarker-driven drug development and the selection or development of related companion diagnostics? What sorts of disease states are you and your partners looking at?
Well, we're actually not interested in any one disease, so we look at the full corpus of information. So across, there's medical information in journals, there's the clinical trial listings, drug labels, drug repositories looking at the drug mechanisms of action, and we take the world's evidence, really put it together and point machine learning to look for trends within that evidence. So the idea is that it's really hard for a single scientist on their own to read through hundreds of journals. I happen to know your NanoString working on the metabolism panel. How do I know what genes to put in that metabolism panel? We point at actually finding out, well, what's the literature, what's the evidence in the world telling us in a data-driven way, and constantly, continuously monitoring to look for those insights.
Can you give us a couple of examples of the types of projects you're working on? I think just a better understanding of what the company does would be great for the audience.
Absolutely. So we've had a lot of success with the diagnostic companies that are looking for deciding what particular, in fact, we've spoken to NanoString recently, specific tests they should be developing or specific test methodologies that they should be investing in. And so what we do in those cases is look for trends within a specific disease to say which biomarkers are trending and associated with a disease so that they could go into a specific panel, or which test methodologies are starting to shift the needle. One of the things that's very interesting is that when we think about, the Oncotype test, or we think about Archer or Foundation for Medicine, they've got a lot of different genes. Those are different test methods. And so it may be that we're measuring potentially apples to oranges. And so what we're trying to do is, can we bring all the evidence together to look through the noise and actually get to an answer?
Right. Kristine, well, perhaps not as sexy sounding as a treatment for a potentially fatal cancer that is personalized based on the patient's own immune system, the ability to prescribe medicines precisely is an extraordinary achievement, and it's incredibly important. Can you tell us a bit about YouScript and how the company's software is improving prescription success?
Sure. So I do agree that a lot of the focus in precision medicine originally started in oncology. A lot of the health systems and academic medical centers would launch precision medicine programs that were almost exclusively focused on oncology to start. But interestingly, we spent $528 billion in 2016 on non-optimized medications, meaning we spend more on non-optimized medications than any major disease, including cancer, and including more than we spend on the drugs themselves. We have been prescribing medication in a one-size-fits-all manner for a very long time, even though the FDA and drug development guidance has said drug-gene interaction should be considered the equivalent of drug-drug interactions. So if you go to the physician or the pharmacy, they will flag and tell you if there's a significant drug-drug interaction that means these drugs should not be taken together. Yet, for the most part, we've ignored this underlying information we understand about our genes and how they will dictate whether some drugs will work for us or not, or whether we need a lower or higher dose to make sure we respond as intended. So I think two things, no matter where you are in precision medicine, at least in clinical applications, your big questions are, how do I know which patients would benefit from this testing? Who needs this test to determine how they're going to respond to drugs? So YouScript actually just got a patent in February on our pharmacogenetic impact probability score. But essentially, based on the medications a patient is taking, I can say, hey, Leslie, there's an 80% chance that if your doctor orders this pharmacogenomic testing for you, they will be recommending at least one evidence-based drug or dose change to you when those results come back. So it's a way to actually stack rank patients most likely to benefit from that intervention. And then when that information comes into the physician's EHR or the pharmacy software system, we can trigger appropriate action based on the latest evidence. So not just these binary interactions, but cumulative ones, rolling them up. My best analogy is Waze. So when you're using Waze, it's like, hey, we shut 99 down, they're doing something to it again. Here, you can take I-5 or you can take surface streets to get where you're going. So what we do when we find interactions, whether it causes drugs, genes, herbals, is reroute. Here's a drug that does the same thing, and it's going to avoid this metabolic traffic jam. So not just saying who is at risk, but also providing actionable guidance on how to reduce it.
So I love everything about that, especially because it can potentially impact so many more people, not just individuals who, as many people as it feels like are getting cancer, is still quite a bit less than who takes medicine. Yeah. But who right now is using this in a clinical environment? Like, okay, if I want that, how do I get this testing?
Yeah, so there's definitely the ability to pay directly for testing, but unfortunately, I don't think that the reimbursement system, payer-wise, has caught up with precision medicine. So a lot of the coverage for this kind of testing is a drug gene pair. So we will cover this 2C19 test if you're taking Plavix, because if you have a certain gene mutation, you will likely fail Plavix therapy and have another heart attack or stroke. Bad outcome. So they'll cover that, but virtually every laboratory you talk to that runs that kind of testing is running a 22 gene panel. So you're paying for the 2C19 test. They're running a 22 gene panel. They're reporting 2C19 only because they get in trouble if they report more.
Wow.
And so you're losing all this information, and a lot of systems are starting to migrate to whole exome sequencing, which includes disease risk with pharmacogenomics. Yet we're still, tied to this old reimbursement paradigm, tied to a single drug or a single disease, when the technology is quickly outpacing it. So right now there are instances where it's covered that way. Most of the more comprehensive testing is being done at the health system level, or by what I call payviders, payer-provider mixes, where it really behooves them to make a more comprehensive investment.
God, you could not have set up the next part of the conversation, because that's exactly where I'd like to get to, is what are the things that are holding us back? And I'm sure some of those are still science, technology, what's out there in tools, and I'd love to hear about that as well. But then at the system level, what's going on in terms of regulatory environments, payments, healthcare systems? And I'd just like this to be an informal and anybody speak up conversation.
I'll start. 15 years ago in precision and personalized medicine, when we got together at these conferences, a lot of it was about the science. And we had at that time very few examples of where we understood enough about the biology, and we actually had a drug that could act on the biology that had made it through clinical trials that we could celebrate and say, this is a good example of precision medicine. I can't tell you how many conferences I went to and heard the Herceptin case study over and over and over again, because we hadn't really had a second. That's really passed. I mean, with all the tools that we have to measure genomics and an explosion in clinical trials, especially in the field of cancer, there are now numerous examples of where we can improve treatment and target therapies better with genomic information. The second big worry was the FDA. And at the time, I remember sitting in meetings 10 years ago where reasonable people were having a debate about whether you could even statistically prove that a subset of patients with a certain biomarker benefited disproportionately to one that didn't, unless you did a randomized trial for that question. And reasonable statisticians, went to blows almost over this, until it was largely settled in a paper that came out, a decade ago, that was ultimately accepted. And now we know that we can look back in time and do these retrospective analyses, and if we do 2 independent studies, it has the statistical power of 1 prospective study. And that's widely accepted. So we kind of put that kind of clinical question to rest. Then we all worried, well, can the FDA possibly evolve their thinking as quickly as the science itself is evolving? And for a while they didn't, but I'll say over the last 5 years they have. I really think the FDA has done an incredibly impressive job of getting their arms around precision medicine, finding ways to regulate it, finding some pathways that actually, I think, provide a nice avenue to get products to market. I'd say the current state of where the state of distress, call it, the part of the system that people worry about is reimbursement. And I don't think our payer systems have evolved yet to make rational choices or be organized around good decision making. And it is things like what you described, where on one side of the healthcare system works on drug utilization and minimizing the amount of overprescribed drugs. And then a totally independent part of that health insurance company works on diagnostic utilization. Let's make sure tests are not done that are unnecessary, or let's grind down the overinvestment in those. And those two things don't necessarily coordinate with each other. And when they do it in a very narrow way, like, oh, okay, if you're going to get this one drug, we should get you this one test. Mm-hmm. When really the question ought to be much more broad. If you're even being considered for any number of drugs in this disease area, you should get this number of tests. So there's a real coordination issue on the reimbursement side. And I think that right now, that is where really a lot of the rub is. And the second place where the rub is actually physician education. Mm-hmm. This flood of science has now worked its way through the regulatory environment, through the clinical studies. It's hitting physicians at an incredible pace, more than they can possibly absorb all these new innovations. And there isn't actually a very good mechanism for educating physicians on just how much the state of the art moves every year. And so the things that you guys are doing in your companies that really are addressing this issue, helping flag when tests are needed and helping physicians know what to do when, these are hugely valuable contributions right now in the current state of personalized medicine. So I'm excited to be up here with you.
Amanda, you're mostly on the preclinical, right, and the clinical, but in trials. You're, would that be true?
We actually support any stage. So
Okay.
it could be that we're helping you identify what a good drug target is, or identifying a pharma company working with a specific drug target, and if you're a companion diagnostic company, partnering you with them. So we're really unbiased, look at all the technology, pointing our tools at it. But I think about what you said about reimbursement rates, and I think it's very interesting to watch the shift that we're seeing in the field. We've now got some pricing models that look at outcome-based pricing. I'm thinking about the CAR-Ts, back to the CAR-Ts. And that really puts the onus back on pharma to say, how do I know that I'm going to have a good outcome? Because if I don't have a good outcome, I'm actually not going to get paid as much. And so you're starting to see a lot more biomarker-driven drug discovery, especially in oncology, where we point at it, but because there is a lot more competition. And this is where I think oncology, or immuno-oncology especially, has had a big burgeoning of success. But now we're going to probably in the next few years start to see diagnostics also having a great deal of success because the pressure is now on biopharma to really make sure that they've got biomarker endpoints. And this is where I think Amplion, what our software does is really help define what that biomarker strategy should be, which will hopefully cut drug development time down, which will then hopefully translate to decreased costs, but also identifying which diagnostic tests give us the best measures.
Brad, when you were talking about the physicians, and by far and away I'm the oldest person on this panel, is remembering that when we were doing those first, even pre-Myriad Genetics, is doing those first predisposition tests and worrying about bringing these outside of academic medical centers, even under IRB protocol situations, is the shortage of genetic counselors, the lack of genetic education by the physicians, and how were we going to make these things available in an appropriate, ethical, reasonable way to the population in need. And now you look at all the testing, right? Consumer-driven genetic testing, 23andMe, different markers. And I'm wondering to sort of where the equation now is between the consumers and the physicians and taking charge of one's own genetic information. Of course, that's talking about the germline, things that you inherit, and yet the information that we are inundated with about all of these areas and decision making is how do we also, while we're trying to teach the docs and the other healthcare providers, is help educate consumers, because I think they're learning fast and they have lots of information, but how do we make sure we're kind of bringing everyone along to understand what these tools are and when they fit and when they don't? Is that a reasonable question?
It's a great question because actually, we all know, we've heard the word HIPAA, right? And part of that HIPAA word we often don't think about as portability. It's the idea that I own my information, my patient information, I can take it with me and go. Most people don't realize that. And even if we do know that, it's really hard to get our patient information out. Or even if I know it, even if I went and I took a specific test, I took Foundation for Medicine, do I know what to do with that information? Do I know which are the right clinical trials for me? And this is an interesting time to look at how do we find solutions that bring your own information together. Certainly with 23andMe, it's a great example. That's a test, where if you read it on the outset, it says, oh, well, you can find out your mutation status for breast cancer 1 and 2. Well, most people don't realize we'll actually test for just a few variants. And so you might feel like a false sense of security. Right. How do I educate patients to know that? And even if you do have that information, how do I put my information together in a way that can be meaningful for my physician, meaningful for me? And is it right that I could potentially buy a test, have my genome sequenced, and then should I be able to sell my genetic information? And there are actually companies that are commercializing people's own information. And so that's kind of an interesting bioethics question as well.
Yeah, I'd like to hear what the other panelists what your thoughts are about that.
It's interesting. So when I first got into pharmacogenomics in 2000, we started offering the testing at a local lab, Genelex, and we offered it direct to consumer, and we got a nasty gram from the FDA that said, hey, I'm not sure if you know this, but we don't like you to give genetic information directly to patients unless a healthcare provider is involved, so please stop doing that. So we started requiring physician authorization to order these tests. And a lot of times this was a patient having to go convince their physician to sign off on something they didn't even understand when the patient had had problems with medications their entire life, had a very good reason to believe they may have a genetic variation that would alter their response to medications. And it's very hard to give the patient the tools they need to have those conversations. So I understand the need to protect patients and have the right caregivers involved. But I do think that right now we have genetic exceptionalism. Like somehow as soon as you say DNA, we're more afraid of it. Like I can go online and I can order all sorts of labs for myself and it's fine. But a consumer-driven DNA test, also fine, although 23andMe had to do a lot with the FDA to be able to report. But one of the things they're able to report on now is pharmacogenomics. To your point, their 2D6 test is terrible. This is one that metabolizes like a quarter of medications, and they're not doing it properly. So people would think that, this is my genetic type for this, and it's not accurate. So I think the push is important, but in my mind, the only way around that is to have access to all of this evidence and have a way to deliver real-time guidance as the evidence evolves and have a clinician involved, ideally telephonically. So there are now telephone genomic counseling services. There are telephone telepharmacy services. And I think that entire loop needs to be completed, because if you walk in as a patient and are like, I shouldn't take this drug, you're likely going to have your physician tell you, I'm the doctor, not you, the majority of the time. But if a pharmacist calls them and says, hey, they're not going to respond to Plavix treatment, it's different. But there's a lot of things that need to loop together interoperably to make that happen.
Brad?
Yeah, I think the consumer can play a really important role as a patient in advocating for the testing that they should get. And that's one of the brute force ways to get over the physician education gap. No one is going to engage more on a certain disease than someone who's just been diagnosed with it. Think about a cancer patient who probably goes and gets on, immediately sits down at a computer, goes to the Mayo Clinic website and reads about the disease, or goes to a chat board and understands what other patients' experiences have been like. And then they may learn about some testing that they could benefit from. And then they walk into their physician's office with a set of printouts, and they've really forced that physician to engage. And it's brute force. I don't like that is the solution to get the physician educated on the test. But in a world where that physician has limited time and limited access to continuing medical education, or they do it once a year and they could be behind, then it works. And so that's part of why you see so much direct-to-consumer advertising and of things genetic, is because it's moving so fast you can use the consumer as a way to get to the physician. I think in the long run, all of medical innovation is going to happen faster than physicians can absorb through a traditional education piece. I mean, whether it's personalized medicine or new therapies or et cetera. And we're going to have to use systems and EMRs and intelligent clinical decision making to help flag and identify where patients need things. It's going to be a much better alternative to some of the brute force methods we have today. But in the meantime, those work.
How are the pharmacists fitting in? Are you spending more time with pharmacists, getting them, and are they asking for the testing because they know the implications of the drug-drug interactions?
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting. We have a team of pharmacists and have for a long time. So pharmacists go to school as long as a doctor to understand how drugs work in the body, and yet they're not recognized federally as healthcare providers. They don't get paid to spend time with patients to optimize medications. But at least for pharmacogenomics, the genetic tests that help determine drug or dose response, I think they're the ideal healthcare provider to optimize that. I think genetic counselors are more helpful when it comes to, reproductive health, genomics, or disease risk. but the pharmacists are going to play a key role in, at least in my mind, in genomics of drug response.
So I'd like to, first of all, are there any questions in the audience? In so many of these panels, there haven't been time, but does anybody have a question they'd like to ask? Okay. Not sure if I think that means we're boring you or it's after lunch coma, but I'll keep going because, again, going back to this time frame of 25 years, which went like that, we always predict things are going to come faster than they do. And I did, so if any of you had a chance to hear Chad Robbins speak this morning about really what's going on is incredible in sequencing of the human adaptive immune system. And Luke did a great job in terms of moderating the panel and really thinking through the idea that we're not just detecting disease earlier, we're redefining what we think of as disease, right? When you're catching something pre-symptomatically and calling it a disease and treating it, we're at a whole nother level of things. And yet when Chad talks about things happening in 6 or 7 years, I think, oh yeah, that probably means it's about 16. You know, it's amazing if you look back on all the great discoveries when people got up with the human genome, right, and said, this is it. It's going to change everything, and it has. But if you went back and looked at the time frames, they predicted for things it's been a lot longer. All that said, when we're looking out, and that's whether you want to believe it's 10 years or it's 20 years, what do we see? What's the ideal, and what's it going to take to get us there? Because I worry about everyone's doing all these big data things, but are the data coming together? For example, how are we going to aggregate all this information that's everywhere, and what does the future look like?
Well, that's exactly why we exist, to bring the data together. And it's a big problem. I mean, I think if we can shift the needle into bringing the data together, putting what's been published with clinical outcomes from clinical trials, and then hopefully also bringing real patient data in as well so that we can drive insight, because right now we're doing it at a population level, but it's very hard to translate those genome-wide association studies to an individual patient risk. Although there's examples of where it works, like the Oncotype test. I think we'll start to shift the needle, but that's going to be the key. What's really great is to see that the FDA is starting to get ahead rather than behind, because certainly, we look at last month, there was the draft guidance on actually how we use clinical decision support. So whether a software, when we use software to guide decisions. And that's really key, because we're really at a place where we need to start to actually use the full corpus of information at our disposal. If we can't get information out of these little silos, we're not going to move the needle fast enough. And right now, even though we talked a lot about oncology, we said oncology is where it's all happening. Well, the reality is precision medicine fails oncology patients 90 to 95% of the time. It just doesn't work. And honestly, Brad, your like the IO360 test, I used it in pharma for years, because we know that it can predict which patients are going to respond to an IO therapy. So how do we find that? If we had been looking in the literature, we would have known that. We would have started to use that. We've got to get the information out of the silos.
Right, and into the literature, because that's where you're getting the data, right?
Right, and that is exactly where, companies like mine, where we're trying to bring the information together and do it in a systematic way, and then hopefully start getting that to community hospitals, to getting it to physicians and getting it in front of them, will start to change things.
Right, but that's where most of the patients are treated,
Yeah.
right?
Community
So
hospitals.
the dilemma is, how are we going to get that data that aren't part of a study? How do we get it all to be part of a study? When I say that, sort of a virtual study.
I think someone mentioned on a panel earlier, most patients are more than happy to share their data when they're asked. Most people want to see people not suffer from disease and lengthen life and have good quality of life. So I think right now the Office of the National Coordinator with the 21st Century Cures Act is trying to break down these walls that are keeping patient data in silos. And ideally, in a wonderful future world, we have something like an HIE that works, that has layers and layers and layers of both clinical data as well as the outcomes seen with that claims, we're going to move from a time where we have to wait. I mean, clinical literature is great, but by the time you do a study and then write it up and then get it published, there's been a really long lag. We know information long before we can make it through that cycle and people actually read it, and then you get it in front of reimbursement boards. So we need to be able to shorten that process in a way that people can trust. We put artificial intelligence and machine learning layers on top of all of that data. We're going to be getting insights that enable us to really fine-tune things. But how do we know we can trust, trust that data repository? But I think that's the perfect future when we finally get there, right?
Where do the patient groups fit in? Because you see them more and more in certain disease states coming together and saying, we own our data and we're going to share our data with who we want. I'm just curious if you've been working with patient groups or how that's happening.
I think that can be really highly impactful in certain areas, certainly in the field of breast cancer, in terms of arguing for the reimbursement and the adoption of the types of tests that you benefited from that help predict who needs chemotherapy. The patient groups were a very important part of the overall equation. I think we're seeing in some of the personalized therapies around rare disease, groups of patients for spinal muscular atrophy and Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, and cystic fibrosis come together and play very big roles in advancing cures in those fields. So I think, but I think that's the exception, not the rule. I mean, most of personalized medicine is going to be on diseases that don't have great advocacy because they don't have great survivorship. A lot of cancers don't really have much advocacy because they're too lethal. Some of them will be in diseases that are about whether or not we should or shouldn't take Plavix. There's not going to be a big group of passionate patients around so narrow a question. There's not a heart attack survivors coalition in the same way. What's that? Yeah,
it's true.
I mean, there's not,
true.
right? And so, or high blood pressure survivors, coalitions, right? I mean, these are the most common diseases. Don't
They call
have
them
that.
vegans.
Yeah, well. So I think it's great when it works, but it's not a generalizable solution.
No, yeah, you're right.
We need I think systems are going to be ultimately critical for us to drive adoption.
Yep.
Employers are more and more pushing things because they're managing the expenses of patients. And I am seeing a lot of innovation just because of the spiraling cost of healthcare coming out of larger self-insured employers that are putting precision medicine programs to work in their employee population. So these patients need, BRCA testing, and these patients need pharmacogenomic testing, and just figuring out the right way to manage an entire population. And that's something I don't think I saw until more recently, but there's definitely trends in that direction. And those are essentially patients banding together because they're all suffering as costs go up as employees and patients.
I think there's also a big role for government. I think about, EMA has been really great about saying quality of life assessments and is a drug targeted and asking for that. And I think we also look at the FDA actually saying, they were pretty upset with the PD-1 test. There was multiple PD-1 tests. Why are there multiple tests? And actually really requesting and being kind of firm on this, that we do the right clinical validity and where possible that we bring, rather than the very typical one test to one drug, which is what allows us to have now 3 different PD-L1 tests out there. Actually, there's more than that now. To saying, we need to show clinical validity and bring the evidence together and let it all be data driven. So I think there is a role for regulators.
I think I'm being told there's a question back here. Yes.
So I wanted to go back to the 23. So I'm an insurance broker, and just yesterday it came up as a discussion point in our firm, and it was regarding 23andMe filing with IRS to make it an eligible FSA or HSA expense. And it's very specific in whether or not it's covered by the insurance company. My question really revolves around so you said, I think Kristine said that it's not as accurate. I'm wondering if it's just because 23andMe is just the saliva. So what would be involved in a test? Would it be blood draw? I mean, what would it take in order to get the accurate information for me as a consumer and then be able to take it to my doctor or my provider so that I could then they can actually do the proper test.
Yeah. I think that the issue right now with 23andMe is that they are doing a fair amount of genes, but not diving deep enough into a lot of them that anybody that's a clinical specialist in that area. So in pharmacogenomics, I mentioned 2D6, they don't do the duplication. So they're missing 5% of patients that are ultra rapid metabolizers. They process those drugs too quickly. So as somebody that's a specialist in that field, I wouldn't trust that test. If I did get that test back and I saw as a physician that somebody was a poor metabolizer or ultra rapid for some of those genes, I would then order testing from somebody else to verify or get additional information. I mean, it's interesting. A patient is likely with a 23andMe test to find at least one genetic variation in pharmacogenomics that could trigger testing that is more reliable clinically. They will get to a point, I think, where they can do more clinically reliable testing across. It's just a matter of that whole, we went from drug gene pairs to panels to now whole exome sequencing to, that includes pharmacogenomics to whole genome sequencing. But it's a matter of cost and coverage. And as that cost continues to come down, we will get more reliable, at least germline testing.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
So when you go back, so I remember when we were doing this testing, oh my gosh, what it took to take fresh, frozen, paraffin-embedded samples that were really not very good. The quality was terrible. But the information that was derived, the way we did a test for somebody who was high risk, how did we know they were high risk? We knew because they had their whole pedigree done by a genetic counselor or a geneticist. And they said, my maternal grandmother died of this, my 2 aunts, my sister, and I'm really worried I'm carrying this. And what you would do is you would sequence something from either a living relative who'd survived it, or out of a paraffin-embedded sample. You'd find the exact mutation in the family. You knew what the variant was. Yeah. And then when you're looking at the other members of the family at risk, you looked for that one thing. It was completely accurate in as far as that information went. So in that family, you'd be pretty sure if you found that mutation, that was it. But what we all know is there's probably a BRCA3. There's probably other genes out there that have not yet been, and maybe they have all been. Maybe I'm out of it. But we always knew there was a lot of information we didn't know, and you had to tell people, you can only base this on, this is a statement I can tell you, you're not carrying the family mutation. What does that really mean in the end in decision making? We'd still probably strongly recommend you get more frequent screening, that you do the following things. But we've advanced a lot, but it's still the exact same challenge, which is you're only reporting on that known information, and people don't really understand that. That was a great question to, I think, unfortunately, just about end with. If there's anything quick, otherwise I just want to thank my panelists, my colleagues.
Thank you.